Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you all for coming to this CodeX Speaker Series event. We have our very own Harry Surden here today. I say very own because Harry was our first CodeX fellow about 8 years ago. And he's moved from his fellowship to a professorship at the University of Colorado, where he teaches IP law. And also technology, legal technology. When he was here at Stanford, he was actually one of the founding members of the Intellectual Property Litigation Clearinghouse, which later on became the first spin-out from Stanford Law School called Lex Machina. Harry received his law degree here from Stanford Law School with honors. He has an undergrad degree in computer science from Cornell University, where he also graduated with honors. And actually, before going to law school, he worked as a software engineer for Cisco Systems and Bloomberg. So Harry has done really some of the foundational work in computational law. He's written one of the most important pieces on computable contracts. He's done a lot of interesting work there. But the topic of his talk today is autonomous driving predictability in the law, which is a project he's an article which he's about to publish. So without further ado, I'll just turn it over to Harry.
Thank you, Roland. Thank you for that introduction. Welcome and thank you for having me. As Roland mentioned, I'm Harry Surden. I'm a professor of law at the University of Colorado Law School. I'm also affiliated faculty member here at the Stanford Center for Legal Informatics, or CodeX. And it's really a pleasure to be back here at Stanford, which is one of my favorite places in the world. As Roland mentioned, my research focuses on intellectual property, but also how technology is applied to the law. And the reason I have this research interest is because I used to be a software engineer for about 5 or 6 years, as Roland mentioned, before going into the law. So today I'm going to talk about self-driving cars, more formally known as autonomous vehicles, and how predictable autonomous vehicles will be to us, the ordinary people that will inhabit their physical spaces. This is a part of a larger project that I'm working on with my co-author, Marianne Williams, who is a professor of robotics and electrical engineering at the University of Technology, Sydney, and she's also a member of CodeX as well. So what is a fully autonomous vehicle? We can describe a fully autonomous vehicle, or a self-driving automobile, are those which can drive themselves without human supervision or input. So with that in mind, let's begin the discussion with a motivating example that caused us to work on this project. Let's imagine a pedestrian at a crosswalk, and let's imagine that there aren't any stop signs or traffic signals at this particular crosswalk, and there's a car approaching the crosswalk. So let's think about the scene from the perspective of the pedestrian. Before stepping into the crosswalk, the pedestrian must predict whether or not the driver of the car is going to stop. As part of this decision, the pedestrian will make a series of instantaneous observations and assessment about the driver's perceptions, capabilities, and intentions. Does the driver see the pedestrian? Is the driver capable of braking? Is the driver intending to stop? So in many cases, an uncertainty in a situation like this will be reduced through communication. Communication between the driver and the pedestrian. So there might be explicit communication. The driver might wave the pedestrian across. There might be nonverbal communication. The pedestrian and the driver might lock eyes, silently indicating that the driver has observed the pedestrian. The driver might communicate his intent to stop by visibly slowing the car right before the crosswalk. And what we see here is that the pedestrian is able to avoid a potentially harmful collision with the car by observing and communicating with the driver. The pedestrian is able to get more information and is able to make better predictions about whether the driver is likely to stop or not. In other words, the pedestrian is creating a better predictive model of the driver's likely intentions. So this ability to observe and communicate with other people in order to make better predictions about their likely activities is an inherent cognitive ability that we as humans all possess. And as we'll discuss, this is part of a larger group of cognitive skills known as the theory of mind abilities. But the important point is that these cognitive abilities allow us to accurately model and predict the activities of other people. And these predictions probably allow society to implicitly avoid a whole lot of accidents that might otherwise occur. Pedestrians, bikers, and drivers all over the country are constantly predicting each other's movements and communicating with one another and avoiding accidents even as we speak. So let's return to the crosswalk example, a pedestrian at the crosswalk with an approaching vehicle. But this time that approaching vehicle is an autonomous vehicle or self-driving car. How does the pedestrian know if she's been detected, her presence has been detected by the car? How can the pedestrian know if the vehicle is going to stop? Can we envision a miscommunication? Imagine that the self-driving car was programmed to always stop or always slow before it approached the crosswalk. But let's imagine further that the self-driving car has not, in fact, detected the pedestrian. There might be a misinterpretation of that visible slowing, that the self-driving car was trying to communicate a signal, hey, it's okay to cross. When in fact, this was not the case. The self-driving car was not intending to send any non-verbal communication. And this is the type of misinterpretation that might occur when we use a human interpretive lens on computers. So this example illustrates the general argument of this talk and the paper we're working on. Our internal cognitive models have evolved to predict the movements and future actions of people. However, as autonomous vehicles emerge and become widely available, because their movements are controlled entirely by a computer, they will be instinctively less predictable. And as I will suggest, part of this is an issue that can actually be remedied through improved technological design. But in general, this is an issue that has not received much focus at all today. So let's start with some basics here before we get into the details of the talk. What are autonomous vehicles? To understand that, we really have to understand what autonomous means in the engineering context. So somewhat surprisingly, it's hard to find a good definition of autonomy in the engineering literature, so I cobbled together my own definition. So I say that the term autonomous is applied to computer-controlled systems that can make important decisions about their own behavior with little or no human intervention. So a good example of this is the familiar Roomba vacuuming robot. And we consider that an autonomous system because it's the robot itself using its onboard sensors and computers that decides where to move and vacuum and how to avoid obstacles such as chairs without being directed by a person. So note that the term autonomous can also apply to non-moving, non-physical systems such as algorithmic financial trading systems, which are sometimes called autonomous trading systems. And we consider that autonomous because it's the computer itself which is making the important decisions concerning the system, which securities and financial instruments to buy and sell and when. And they execute these purchases on their own without human intervention. So in summary, the major feature of an autonomous system is its ability to make self-directed choices about its own important activities in the face of a changing and unpredictable physical or data environment. So in the context of autonomous cars, it's therefore important to distinguish between partially autonomous cars and fully autonomous cars. So engineers classify different technological systems along a spectrum of autonomy to the extent a system makes its own decisions about its own important actions. So on the one side, if we have a human making all of the important decisions, such as on a bicycle, we have little or no autonomy in that case. On the other end of the spectrum, if we have a system where the system itself is making all of its own important decisions about its own activities. We can say it's fully autonomous. And somewhere in the middle, we have partially autonomous systems. Those are systems in which some important decisions are done by a computer and some important decisions are done by humans. So our project and much of the interest is focused on fully autonomous vehicles. And a vehicle is fully autonomous if it makes all of the important driving decisions itself, including steering, braking, obstacle avoidance, and navigating, as opposed to today, where humans make most of those important driving decisions. However, it's important to note that, so that's a fully autonomous vehicle. However, it's important to note that nearly all existing automobiles exhibit at least some degree of partial autonomy, if we define that as the extent to which a computer is making some important decisions about driving. Just by way of simple example, consider an airbag. Right? It's not the human driver that decides when to deploy the airbag. It's a computer sensor which decides when to deploy that. However, beyond airbags, a more significant trend in partial autonomy in driving are what are known as advanced driver assistance systems, or ADAS systems. And this is the term that applies to a series of emerging driving systems that take control of particular driving functions. So some of you may have cars that have these features. Examples include adaptive cruise control. So you can put this on cars that have this feature, and the car will automatically accelerate or decelerate or brake and keep you a certain distance behind the car in front of you. Another ADAS feature is lane keeping, which if it detects that you're drifting across a lane boundary, it'll actually take the steering wheel and correct you and keep you within the lane boundary. And then another important one is automatic emergency braking, where the car will detect when there's an imminent collision in a car in front of you and actually apply the brakes for you, stopping your car. However, it's important to know that even with ADAS systems, which are emerging commonly today, these are partially autonomous systems. The human is still in control of most or all of the important driving functions. So this is still considered partial autonomy. However, it's important to note that the technology which permits ADAS systems like automatic braking are many of the same technologies that are used in fully autonomous vehicles. So even though ADAS systems do not exhibit full autonomy, their increasing presence in existing consumer vehicles represents a substantial movement along the spectrum towards increased autonomous control in the driving context. Thus, many of the key ingredients of self-driving cars are already here and on the roads. And the arrival of the first fully autonomous consumer car will be less of a gigantic leap over today's technology on the road than some suspect. So for example, Tesla recently made the news by releasing an autopilot mode for the highway, where the car essentially drives itself on highway conditions. And this is what I would consider advanced partial autonomy. However, it is not full autonomy, because full autonomy would involve the car you simply indicating where your destination is, and the car takes you there without any further input. So it's important to make that distinction between partial autonomy and full autonomy. This project will be focused on fully autonomous vehicles. So now that we've clarified that distinction, let's do a brief overview of the state of autonomous vehicles today. So the technology is actually quite advanced today. Many major car companies have deployed fully autonomous research vehicles on public roads, and collectively these vehicles, most notably the ones created by Google, have driven over 2 million miles fully autonomously on public roads with ordinary people, cyclists, and other drivers. Autonomous vehicles are also being used commercially today as we speak. In particular in Australia, they're being used in mining operations in distant and remote parts of the outback to drive back and forth on their own. So when are the first autonomous vehicles going to be sold to consumers? Well, as you might expect, the estimates vary quite widely. On the low end, some people predict as soon as 3 years, which I'm a little doubtful about. And on the upper end, some experts estimate 15 years for a fully autonomous consumer vehicle. So it's a pretty wide range. Why the wide range? Well, there are reportedly some technological hurdles to overcome. So for one, purportedly fully autonomous cars today have trouble in certain weather conditions, such as snow, lots of snow, or in dense urban environments like downtown Manhattan. So maybe there's 10% of technological hurdles still to overcome. That will take some time. And there are also, since we're in a law school, legal and policy issues to deal with. And those, not surprisingly, will take some time to work out. So why are autonomous vehicles expected to become widely dispersed at some point? Well, there are two primary reasons. The first one is safety. Autonomous vehicles are expected to be much safer drivers than human drivers. So if you look at accident statistics, 90% of accidents are caused by driver error. So these are things like inattention, texting while driving, sleepiness, intoxication, etc. So self-driving cars don't suffer from these ailments. Your self-driving car won't get intoxicated and it won't get sleepy, or we hope. Experts estimate that autonomous vehicles will reduce accidents anywhere between 30 and 80% if they're widely deployed on the road. And the second reason they're likely to be curry favor with some people is convenience. Everybody becomes a passenger rather than a driver in an autonomous car, and you can simply do what you want to do inside the car without having to pay attention to the road. So it's important to draw a distinction, which is at the heart of this talk, that autonomous vehicles represent a novel class of moving machines in our society today. So today we do have free-ranging moving machines in our environment, such as cars and construction equipment, but these are controlled by people, human drivers. On the other end of the spectrum, we do have automated or autonomous moving machines in our environment, such as elevators or escalators, but these computer-controlled machines are largely constrained by tracks or other limitations. Autonomous vehicles represent a novel middle ground where you have a computer-controlled machine with free range of movement. And this is not something we have seen largely in our physical environment. So most notably, as me and my co-author are arguing, the movements of computer-controlled machines with considerable freedom of range are likely to be less predictable to ordinary people than the movements of comparable people-controlled machines. And because autonomous vehicles are large, self-directed, and moving, there is the chance of physical harm. So to understand the predictability argument that we're making, it is important to first understand how self-driving cars work. So at this point, I'm just going to briefly provide an overview of the technology that allows self-driving cars to drive themselves. But before I do, let me make a few disclaimers. First, this is meant as a non-technical overview, so I'm necessarily going to oversimplify what is at its heart very complex technology, so understand that. Second, multiple researchers are pursuing multiple strategies for creating self-driving cars. So this will highlight some of the common strategies, but it may not represent any one single strategy of any particular research group. And then finally, these companies and research groups are very secretive about the particular approaches that they're taking. So this discussion is based upon public research or public discussions, and there might be other technologies that are not publicly talked about. All right, so at a high level, we can think of autonomous vehicles as using technology to answer three basic questions. Where are they located? What objects are around them? And where is it desirable, safe, and legal to move next? So within this framework, a self-driving car must be able to determine and understand driving features such as stop signs, traffic signals, and lane boundaries, and navigate within an environment filled with moving obstacles such as other vehicles, pedestrians, and cyclists, and animals. All right, so let's focus on question number 1. Where am I located? So in most cases, self-driving vehicles operate best when they can precisely determine their geographic location in the world. So this might include a general understanding of where I'm located. I'm driving north on Route 101, which is the road in the direction, and then a more specific location. What lane in particular in Route 101 am I in? So to determine their location through localization, self-driving vehicles often use a two-stage system. The first is to use global positioning satellites, or GPS, to determine their approximate location, which can usually be used to detect the current road and the direction on the road. And GPS can be used to provide a reasonably accurate approximation of where you are. However, GPS is not precise enough for our autonomous driving. Why not? Well, autonomous cars must be able to determine their precise location down to centimeters, even millimeters. An error of position as much as 6 inches can put you into oncoming traffic. And that's a problem. So GPS can be inaccurate by as much as 6 to 8 meters, which is too little precision. Therefore, autonomous cars must usually supplant their GPS determinations with more precise localization procedures and positioning procedures. And to do this, they'll often use a variety of sensors, which, having located their position generally, will use sensors to detect road features, such as lane markings or other boundaries, and compare them to pre-built digital maps. And then they can determine, for example, I'm probably in this particular lane on Route 101 driving north. So that's localization, how the self-driving car determines where it is generally and then where it is precisely. The second major question is, what objects are around me currently? So this actually breaks down into 2 sub-questions. First, what moving and fixed obstacles are around me. So a moving obstacle will be something like another car or a cyclist or a pedestrian, and a fixed obstacle will be something like a curb or a median. And the second part of the question is, what traffic features are around me? What stop signs or traffic lights or lane markings do I need to be aware of? So to detect all of these items, both obstacles and traffic features, self-driving cars rely on a variety of sensors. So sensors are devices which take in information about the outside world primarily and convey that information to the self-driving car's onboard computer system. So the most important sensors are radar, which bounces radio waves off of objects to detect their position, speed, and direction of movement. LiDAR, which is analogous to radar, except it uses laser or light to bounce light beams off of objects to detect their position and movement. And video cameras. Video cameras use parallel images to detect object distance and speed, much the way the human eye uses parallax to detect the distance of objects. So the most important function of these features is obstacle detection and avoidance. That's the most important part of a self-driving car. The vehicles have to ensure that they do not collide with nearby pedestrians, cyclists, or other cars. To do this, they typically use their sensors to build a live map of all moving surrounding objects. The vehicle must not only detect the objects, however, such as a car in a parallel lane, it has to be able to predict its future location based upon its current movement and speed. So this is actually one of the strengths of self-driving cars. They have a 360-degree range of vision, and they can detect objects that human drivers cannot detect, such as those coming sideways or even in the dark. They have better detection capability. But driving is a complicated task. You not only have to avoid obstacles around you, you have to also be able to detect driving features, such as stop signs, traffic signals, and lane markings. So to do this, self-driving cars often rely heavily on video cameras. The video cameras are used often to read things such as the color of the traffic light or to detect that a certain sign coming up is a stop sign. And they use very complex algorithms to make these determinations. However, in addition to using video cameras to detect the state of driving features, self-driving cars also often rely on pre-built digital maps. Google purportedly follows this approach. So they purportedly pre-drive all of the routes that their self-driving cars are going to drive on, and then use the sensors in the car to create digital maps. And then they purportedly have teams of people who manually annotate the digital maps, for example, saying a stop sign is here, a traffic light is here, et cetera. And so when a self-driving car, such as Google's, arrives at a particular intersection, it can call up a pre-annotated digital map and know that there should be a stop sign or a traffic signal at a particular intersection. So supposedly, this combination of having annotated pre-built digital maps in combination of sensors is supposed to be one of the best strategies for having a well-functioning self-driving car. However, this is one of the biggest divides among research groups. The degree to which the research group uses pre-built, pre-driven digital maps plus sensors, or the degree to which the research group relies on live sensor information alone. And then finally, we get to what is really the heart of self-driving cars. Where is it safe, legal, and desirable to move next? So all autonomous vehicles have a supervisory computer system that coordinates all the inputs and activities of the vehicles and then directs the vehicle to take some action based upon the input. So in many ways, this is the core of autonomous driving, as the computer system is making automated decisions about how to direct its own movements, whether to accelerate, whether to brake, steer, where to go, based upon what it has detected about its surroundings. So the vehicle's central computer supervisory system takes all the data from the computer sensors, the LiDAR, the radar, the video cameras, and then uses a variety of sophisticated algorithms. It combines it with information from the digital maps, if they're available, and it creates a plan about what activity it should do next that's in accordance with the driving laws, the driving conditions, and the destination route. This is very, very complex. The system often has to identify and distinguish objects. For example, it needs to be able to tell the difference between a cyclist and a car and a pedestrian, and how to navigate a driving turn across a crowded intersection. And to do this, they often use a flexible programming approach known as machine learning, which I've discussed and written about in earlier talks. So it's important to note that this process of sensing, scanning, and planning and acting is a constant one. The self-driving vehicle is constantly scanning its environment thousands of times per second and reassessing in light of new information. So because of this constant scanning and reanalysis, the vehicle can rapidly detect any changes in conditions, such as a pedestrian that suddenly darts in front of a car, and it can adapt to these changing conditions, which is another reason that self-driving cars have so far been such good drivers. So stepping back for a moment, we can now understand the broad strokes of how self-driving cars or autonomous vehicles drive themselves. They're constantly determining where they are. They're constantly scanning to determine moving and fixed obstacles around them and detecting nearby traffic features, often in coordination with a map. And then they're using complex computer algorithms to figure out where to go next. So importantly, to the point of this talk, this action is all mediated through computer algorithms. The computer decides what actions to take, whether braking, accelerating, or steering, based upon its analysis and what it's detected. So now that we understand how self-driving cars work more broadly and how they direct their own movements using sensors and computers, it's time to turn here a little bit and talk about a theory of mind. So in our usage, the term theory of mind refers to the various cognitive mechanisms that humans use to assess the mental states and likely future actions of other people. So we use observation, communication, and theory of mind mechanisms to predict the likely outcome and behavior of others around us. And we do this very reliably, remarkably reliably. So we evolved these cognitive abilities because we evolved together in groups. Humans operated in groups, and it was important to predict the future actions and the likely mental states of those around you in order to survive. So one argument is that this ability to reliably predict the behavior of others allows society to avoid a great deal of physical harm that might otherwise occur on a daily basis. So there's this implicit avoidance mechanism that we all share that's allowing us to avoid all this physical harm that might otherwise occur due to various collisions. So consider the following example. Think about a crowded sidewalk in a city such as San Francisco or New York City, and think about how remarkable it is that hundreds of people can mill to and fro rapidly, coming at each other or going in parallel with each other, and still avoid physical collisions. Humans are really good at anticipating the movements of other people in their general physical vicinity, and we rely upon instinctive mechanisms for doing this. Nobody is sitting there calculating the trajectory of the person walking towards them with a calculator. However, when it comes to autonomous systems and self-driving cars, we do not possess comparable predictive abilities. So this has generally not been a problem up until this point. The automated moving machines in our physical environment, such as elevators and escalators, are actually quite predictable. They're predictable because they're constrained in their range of movement. So we haven't had to worry about the fact that we can't easily predict the range of elevators and escalators and other automated moving machines. However, autonomous vehicles and other autonomous machines do have considerable freedom of movement. So this is interesting. This presents a bit of a paradox. Autonomous vehicles are actually quite predictable from the perspective of the engineers who design them. They unfailingly follow the rules of their program, and they do exactly what they're supposed to do according to their programming. However, the paradox is from the perspective of ordinary people, the ordinary people like you and I who live, work, or who will live, work, and operate in the physical environment and general vicinity, we do not have the capacity to reliably anticipate their actions. The theory of mind mechanisms that do allow us to reliably predict the movement of other people may not work so well when the movements are decided by computers using algorithms rather than humans using brains. So this can be understood again by returning to our example before of the pedestrian at the crosswalk with the autonomous car approaching. Think of it from the perspective of the pedestrian. What is the vehicle going to do? Is it slowing because it's trying to send a signal? Is it going to stop? Is it going to let me cross? Can I reliably step in front of the autonomous vehicle knowing and believing it's going to stop? Has it detected me? So the crosswalk example is just one of a larger class of conflict scenarios that we're focused on between communication and theory of mind that might arise in the autonomous car context that do not rise in the context of people-driven cars because of our models of human behavior. So we might call what's going on here an example of what we term technological opacity. Technological opacity is our term, and it refers to the inability of ordinary people to know what is going on inside a technological system, whether it's an autonomous car, your cell phone, or your desktop computer. And a related problem of technological opacity is that it's often difficult to understand why a technological system took a particular action that it did, as we're all familiar with our desktop computers. So evolution has given us the remarkable ability to peer inside the mind of other people with tremendous reliability. But in the case of autonomous free-ranging systems, we do not have such a comparable instinctive mental tool. Simply by observing an autonomous vehicle, we cannot tell things such as what data the vehicle has gathered, has it detected me or not, what information is that system paying attention to. So even if the system has detected me, the system might not be paying attention to that particular information. There's no guarantee it's going to act on that information, nor what internal control algorithm is in effect at the moment and what that algorithm is going to instruct the vehicle to do next. This is because, like all technological systems, the only thing we know about them is due to technological design. What the interface engineers who designed it have chosen to communicate about the internal workings to the wider world. For complex electronic systems, we only know precisely what the design engineers have chosen to communicate to us and nothing more through some sort of user interface. So this problem of technological opacity in the case of autonomous cars, the inability to predict the movement of a system or understand why it took a movement that it did, may be more significant with the arrival of self-driving cars operating in a dynamic and changing environment such as self-driving cars in traffic. And moreover, when the actions are based upon non-linear programming but more probabilistic programming such as machine learning, it becomes potentially even harder to predict for ordinary people. Thus, we believe that a pedestrian won't instinctively know what a self-driving car is going to do, nor will a fellow driver, nor will necessarily the passenger of the car. There are no longer drivers, remember, in self-driving cars. Will the passenger know what to do? So we could imagine a conflict between the communications of the self-driving car and the communications of the passenger in the car. Imagine that the passenger of the car waves the pedestrian across to be polite, but the self-driving car decides to go forward. The passenger is not, in fact, in control of the self-driving car. All right, so we've kind of established this idea that this is an issue that we need to think more carefully about. There may be issues of predictability. So just to be clear, I'm not saying that self-driving cars are going to be less safe. Quite the opposite is true. They're likely to be safer. However, within this context of improved safety, there are certain conflict scenarios that we need to think very carefully about. And we need to think about how to make self-driving cars more predictable to the ordinary people who will share their physical space. So can we do anything about this? Well, I believe the answer is probably yes, through engineering design decisions that explicitly focus on communicating the intentions of self-driving cars and the internal states that are relevant to ordinary people. I think we can improve the design of self-driving cars to make them much more predictable to the ordinary people that share their space. And there are, of course, entire fields, even here at Stanford, dedicated to precisely the issue of making technology more understandable and more user-friendly. These go under the headings such as human factors engineering or human-computer interface. And engineers are indeed busy looking at various aspects of communicating the internal operations of self-driving cars. However, they are not focused, for my research, as much on this issue of communicating it externally. They're primarily focused on communicating the information to those inside the car, the passengers, and making that information more transparent and less focused externally. So that's the purpose of our project, to raise this awareness and start thinking more about it. We believe that autonomous vehicles can be designed to communicate their intentions to others. And this might be more of a transitional problem, too. So when self-driving cars first emerge, people are going to be confused by them. They're not going to understand how they operate. But over time, people will understand how they operate, and through education, this will also improve and reduce the chance of conflict. So it's not only about design. I heard a podcast recently that when elevators first came out, people were really confused by them and didn't want to interoperate with elevators at all. Understandably, why would you want to get yourself inside a closing box? These days, we have so much confidence in elevators, we will confidently stick our arm in a closing elevators, quite believing that the elevator will not chop our arm off, but will instead detect it and open the elevator door. So people's perceptions and interactions with technology change over time. All right, so a looming question is, if we can design autonomous vehicles to make them more predictable to ordinary people, should the law have anything to do about it, right? We're at a law school. I'm a law professor. We have to talk about the law a little bit. So there are different lines of thinking about this. On the one hand, there are quite detailed federal regulations today which require very specific design details on today's non-autonomous or ordinary cars. There are literally pages and pages of regulations specifying how your car dashboard should look. And every other detail you can think of is specified in federal regulations. So one argument goes, look, a set of specific regulations or performance standards that require autonomous cars to better communicate their intentions to the outside world are not that different from the kind of specificity that we see today. However, there's a countervailing view, I think, which is about institutional competence. And this is a general type of legal argument which states, is the government really the right institution with the right expertise to be making this kind of decision versus maybe the private sector or even some industry group? And I think there's a pretty good argument that maybe they're not in such a dynamic area such as self-driving cars. They're not even on the road yet en masse. And it's a new emerging technology that's likely to change substantially over the years. And then another argument says, look, predictable design will emerge on its own in the shadow of the law. So what do I mean by that? Well, one might argue that self-driving car companies are not focused on external predictable design yet, but they will be soon, either because they're watching this talk or because they have a fear of future lawsuits. So the fear of liability is itself enough to foster design changes. So the law is already involved and doesn't need to do anything. Or insurance companies are another big motivator. Insurance companies might step in and say, hey, you need to really add these design features if you want us to insure you. So my own thinking is that, at least at the moment, the law should largely stay out of explicit regulations until the field is more mature. This is a rapidly changing area. Self-driving cars 2 years ago look even different than self-driving cars today. And it's really hard to understand the dynamics that are going to develop once there are lots of self-driving cars on the road, which might not happen for another 15 or 20 years till we get full market saturation. And I think that at the moment, the companies have enough incentives on their own to deal with this. Perhaps down the road, when the technology becomes more mature, the government can start regulating it the way they regulate other aspects of car design. So in final thoughts, I just want to note that a lot of the concerns that we're raising here actually apply to other autonomous systems, autonomous moving systems outside of the autonomous car context. And in particular, I want to focus on robots. So today, robots may be a common sight here at Stanford in research laboratories, but out in the wider world, they're not quite as common. Primarily, robots exist in specialist settings like factories or research laboratories, but some experts predict robots to emerge in the consumer setting in the next 20 years more broadly, particularly large robots that are capable of doing physical harm. So for instance, if you're standing behind a large robot, maybe a human-sized robot with a large arm that's capable of swinging, and you're standing behind it, you probably want to know a few things, such as, has that robot detected that I'm behind it? And also, is it going to swing its arm anytime soon? So this is a similar issue because we have an autonomous system that is capable of movement and physical harm, and we want to know certain things if we're going to be operating in its physical vicinity. And we can think of autonomous cars as just a special instance of robots. So if we think of robot under the definition of a computer controlled system that moves or has some operation on the physical world, we can think of autonomous vehicles as robots. And there'll probably be the first example of robots that are large and widely distributed in the consumer space. So that's why that's our focus. All right, so let me stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions from the audience.
Any questions for Harry? Sir.
When you compared the predictability of drivers to robots, you seem to be implying that drivers are more predictable, when in fact, in your crosswalk situation, you have what we might stereotypically call the teenage driver, who's going to accelerate in order to get through the crosswalk before the pedestrian reaches the middle. You're going to have the let's say, the antiquated driver who is going to pull right up to the crosswalk and slam the brakes on. And you're going to have the middle-aged driver who sees the pedestrian and slows down a block away in order not to have to put the brakes on. That doesn't even cover the full range of human behaviors. Isn't it going to be necessary to define what type of human behavior the autonomous car is going to emulate? And secondly, are you going to have that autonomous car pass a driving test?
This is a great question. So you're absolutely right. And I was trying to highlight this during the paradox example. It's not to say that autonomous cars will be broadly less predictable. I think they'll actually be more predictable in most circumstances than human drivers. It's just in these particular high conflict contexts where communication and discovery of intention are important to resolving uncertainties that they will be less predictable. But they're not necessarily less predictable more broadly. Will they have to take driving tests? I think they will, in a sense, to the extent the government is involved. Already the government requires that car makers adhere to performance standards, such as crash safety standards and other sorts of standards for their cars. I imagine in the future that with self-driving cars, they'll put them through driving tests, testing the different car manufacturers' abilities to handle various circumstances. So I don't think any individual car is going to have to pass a driving test, but I think the company hardware and software will probably have to pass driving standards, if I had to guess.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm very curious about the legal implications of building into the algorithm the choice between saving the owner / passenger versus the general public. So I can imagine a crash situation where as the collision is about to occur, the computer inside the car can decide, am I going to take action that most likely will save the person inside this car, or most likely will save the maximum amount of people outside of the car? So are there maybe already existing laws for other technology that would speak to that, or where do you think that trend would go?
Yeah, that's a good question. So this is a variant of the famous philosophy trolley problem, right? And that problem basically says, if there's a trolley, headed towards a group of people, and you can push somebody in front of that trolley, and that'll stop the trolley. You'll kill one person, but maybe you'll save 10 person. And it's this idea of, if we take moral actions. And my own thinking is that there's probably not going to be explicit morals embedded into self-driving cars. The same way, I don't think most drivers who are faced with that decision in the real world, and I imagine it really doesn't happen all that often, but when it does, it's probably a split-second decision. You don't have 20 minutes or an hour to deliberate about, should I kill this person or that person? Often you're instinctively swerving. And I think that's a pretty good analogy to the way I think it'll play out in the self-driving car context. The self-driving car has sensors, and it's constantly sensing and trying to avoid obstacles. And at some point, it's going to try and avoid one obstacle versus another, and whatever that algorithmic choice will have some real-world consequence. But I think, like in the real world, it won't happen all that often compared to the instances of driving out there. That's my own, but really good question.
I have a question. You said there was, I think, 2 million miles driven in the autonomous cars to date. I think coincidentally there was actually a collision that involved 2 autonomous cars here in the Silicon Valley. Do you know what's been learned from these incidents as to what are they learning from these collisions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the 2 questions I always get are the trolley problem, which is good, and then the accident problem, which are both really, I think, interesting questions. So I'm glad you guys asked it. So one question that always comes up is what happens with legal liability? My own view is that it's not that complex a question, that our current liability system is quite equipped to handle it in terms of product liability and insurance. And it'll largely be an insurance issue and a product liability issue. But your second question is, and I actually anticipated this, I think there's one really interesting thing that is going to come out of self-driving cars. So what you see here is a accident reconstruction of a a car that collided into the Google self-driving car. You see that right there? I'll play it one more time so you can see it. And what I think is really interesting is that basically we have a very detailed map of exactly what happened in this accident. So Google was able to show, look, we were stopped and we were hit from behind and it was not our fault. How do we know? Because we are up there. Anyway, they were up there and they were able to show exactly how the accident happened. And I think that's a really interesting twist what's going to happen to accidents in the future. We have this data. We have a live map of all the obstacles around us, how they were moving, and how they interacted. And that's a new thing. We don't have that. And I think we're learning really interesting things about how to reconstruct accidents. But I actually hadn't heard of the collision between 2 self-driving cars. I need to look into that. So thanks for bringing that to my attention.
Hey, Harry. So this past weekend, the Tesla P85D and I think a couple others had a software upgrade for the auto drive. And there's some funny videos out of consumers thinking that it would responsibly drive itself and not run into other cars or go over the lane. And in many instances, it did. And so they had to grab the steering wheel and quickly jerk it. And there was this one woman who commented, well, what would have happened had I not grabbed the wheel? Or I had no idea I had to grab the wheel. And so when I think about this, my question is are you sure it's not time for regulators to kind of look at these software upgrades? Because they're not all made the same, as you noted. And maybe, I don't know, there's a lot consumers don't know.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good point. And these same issues that are going to occur in fully autonomous cars are already occurring today in partially autonomous cars. And it's quite likely that this issue is going to arise during one of these ADAS systems like lane keeping or Tesla autopilot, where somebody thinks they can take their hand off the wheel when in fact they can't. So in one sense, you're right. I mean, I think the government should at least be taking a harder look at this than it is currently. At a minimum, I'm just a little skeptical that the government really would get its head around it when, in fact, even the industry is still not getting its head around it. But you're right, these are issues that are occurring today. And actually, there's kind of a debate in the self-driving car field, which is, do you keep the human in the loop? Meaning, do you mostly drive the car and let the human goof off until you need them and have them grab the wheel? So that's one set of approaches, which this kind of represents. And there's another set of approaches, which is, let's take out the steering wheel entirely. Why? Because we don't want the humans doing anything, because they're not going to be ready to take over. I actually agree with the latter approach, because if you're going to go full autonomy, you really don't want the human to have to suddenly take over and be responsible. I'm more of the, let's get the technology good enough that we can remove the steering wheel and not require a human in the loop. But now we're in this weird middle ground where we do have humans in the loop. Yeah, great question.
So in contrast to Tesla, Google and other companies have been seemingly working pretty close with regulators, both at the federal level and at the state level. And I'm curious what you think about that and whether that's the right role for government, because, you were talking about how the government would have a tough time wrapping their mind around the tech. I mean, most of these tech companies probably have a rough time wrapping their head around the different safety regulations the government's already put in place, why they've put in place those types of regulations. It seems like there's a lot of opportunity for sharing expertise on both sides.
Absolutely, and I think that is the way it's going to emerge. That's the same way the existing car regulations have developed. Now, of course, the whole Volkswagen case raises some questions. So a lot of these rules have performance standards where a car company can say, you had a rule that our car had to do such and such, and we confirm that this design of car does that. And the government basically more or less trusts them, not quite, but so this raises some issues to what extent we should be trusting researchers or not. But you're right, I think if these are not going to be developed in a vacuum, there'll be certainly interplay with industry at the moment.
Yeah, another question about role of government. When you were describing some of the technical challenges that are sort of holding up the design, it seems like, I'm not a technical expert, but it seems like if a city were to step up and say, we'll put sensors in stop signs and lanes and so forth, it seems to me that must rapidly accelerate the development of vehicles that can respond appropriately to their surroundings. Are there examples of that, places that have decided to facilitate the development of these vehicles by becoming proactive from the public side?
I am not aware of cities that have designed their physical landscape. So there's kind of two lines of thinking in self-driving cars. Do you make smart cars or smart roads? So what you're saying is an example of what I would call a smart road, where you make the features of the roadscape help automatic driving, or you can primarily focus on making the car smart enough to figure out dumb roads. The smart road approach was largely abandoned because it was seen as fairly infeasible, back in the 80s and 90s and earlier when it was tried. But I think it's an interesting point. At a minimum, as I said, that certain car companies, purportedly Google, pre-drive all the routes and that their self-driving cars are going to drive and hand annotate maps so that the cars have an idea of what driving features they're going to encounter, say, at the next intersection. So, but you can think of a problem with that, right? So what happens if Google drives a street and then the day after they drive, they install a stop sign, right? So there's going to be a disagreement between the pre-built map and the live information from the sensor. So one way you could have cooperation with the government is maybe by updating, map vendors saying, hey, a new stop sign went in here. Let's keep this current. But I think it's an interesting idea. I'm not aware of any city that's doing that. Yeah.
Hello. What's your long-term vision for autonomous vehicles, particularly as it relates to the ownership of vehicles? Will individuals themselves own vehicles? And relatedly, will there be one company like Google that controls the traffic of an entire country, or will there be competing companies, or what do you see?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's kind of a debate that is going on. Will people own self-driving vehicles, or will be part of this sort of sharing or on-demand economy where every day when you go to work, you'll just call a self-driving vehicle. You don't really care which one that comes, as long as it comes on time, takes you, drops you off, and then another one takes you back. I think that in the long term, it seems more likely that that is going to occur just because it just makes more sense. But I think in the interim, I don't know how long this, initially people will own their own self-driving cars the way we own cars today, I think, as part of a transition. That's just my own view. Yeah.
I was curious if you saw last week, well, first, Volvo has announced they're going to have fully autonomous vehicles on the road in Sweden by 2017, so very soon. And then they took a bold move last week by announcing that they would take all liability for any collisions from any of their cars. So I happened to be with somebody from Farmers Insurance who said they fully predicted that if more OEMs did that, that they would no longer have to insure vehicles in the way they do today. So I'm curious if you've seen other automakers agree to do similar things in terms of what Volvo did in terms of taking all liability.
I think that's an important step. Now, what I'll say, the slightly cynical comment is, they were probably already on the hook anyway through product liability laws, so they're kind of just getting out in front of the issue. That's what most people believe, but I think it's an important step, so why not clear the air? And I think you're right. I think once these become fully saturated in the market, it's important to note that there's a difference between the first consumer self-driving cars arriving in the market, which could be anywhere from 3 to 15 years or maybe even 2 years, as you said, in Sweden, and saturation, which is there are enough self-driving cars on the road that it makes a statistical difference in driving. That's likely to be a much larger time window. People don't really know when that window is going to be, but a lot of these massive reductions are going to occur when there's saturation versus initial introduction of the market.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I'd like to get your thoughts on a slightly different liability and collision problem. So if you imagine the following a pretty simple scenario, let's say we're driving down a one-lane in each way road, and there's a truck in front of you, and you're in a self-driving car, and the truck breaks down, it turns on its hazard light, stops towards the shoulder of the road, but the truck is so big that it's still blocking part of the lane. So now any human driver, if you're driving your car, you would look to the other side and just say, oh, there's no car here, I'm just gonna cross this double yellow line and then pass this truck. But for an autonomous car, first of all, it's strictly illegal to do that. And if an autonomous car does do that, and then the programmers program that capability in, and it ever gets into a collision, then the car company or the programmer is going to be liable because it built in this inherently illegal maneuver. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a great. So as the law professor, usually I'm the one posing the hypotheticals, but I'll take one from you. So I think that's a good point. So a lot of people, like in law, focus on the sort of the corner cases, which will inevitably arise, just like you said, simply due to the millions of miles that are driven. So things like that will happen. And then, so I think our liability standards are probably going to change, and they're going to look less at things like negligence and more at internalizing the costs of these inevitable accidents. So the cost of the cars are going to reflect two things. Number one, they're going to be reflect a societal savings because they're likely to be fewer accidents overall. So the extent that insurance reflects the cost of accidents broadly, that should go down. On the other hand, it's going to reflect the possibility of certain other of these accidents, and that'll somehow be baked into the price of the car or the price of the insurance. So I don't know how that particularly would go shake out, but I tend to think there will be less questions of negligence the way we have today in human driving, and more towards the line of some sort of either strict liability or no-fault insurance.
Sorry, just to follow up. If you're a software engineer and programming this, would you actually program in this maneuver instead of just having it wait behind the vehicle that's broken?
That's a really good question. So as I've done some research, there are surprisingly specific scenarios baked into self-driving cars. So there's I was just reading how the Google car can read bicycle hand signals and things like that. And so it wouldn't entirely surprise me if that kind of scenario were specifically baked into the programming. Yeah.
I read that Uber is working heavily on self-driving cars. What are your thoughts on the wider implications when a significant part of the workforce that today makes its living driving vehicles is now superfluous?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a real dislocation, and it's going to be a big societal issue. Right, a lot of people, truckers, taxi cab drivers, et cetera, make their living. What's interesting is that I think Uber's current business model is we're going to employ drivers, and their long-term business model seems to be we're going to put you out of business as drivers, which is kind of interesting. But they're probably, looking at the future. It's sort of, I think, inevitable that self-driving cars are going to come. But I think there's going to be a lot of people out of work, just like any of these areas of automation. A lot of people are being dislocated, and it's a real societal problem, just as most waves of automation, whether in farming or manufacturing, have dislocated people, and it's created a lot of serious problems.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. My question is, when thinking about all the legislation and regulation that are going to be needed to be passed through in order for all of this to happen, it sounds like you're thinking that within sort of the next 20 years that we're going to see sort of, as you mentioned, this saturation. I'm wondering why. I've read a lot of reports that range with much greater sort of number of years. So I'm wondering why you think that it will only be 20 years till we reach that point.
Oh, that's just an estimate based upon, I'm just sort of rehashing what other people out there who have studied it have said. But you're right, the range is 20 years is probably the early end. It could be longer. So take that with a grain of salt. Yeah, that wasn't a specific prediction on my part.
Hi, I have a question regarding the security of the software. Such software has to be like unhackable in order to secure the driving. Like, do you foresee that even as possibility? Is there an unhackable system?
Yeah, that's a great question. Right, so yeah, recently there have been some examples where hackers have shown that they can hack into even existing car software and take control and create problems. So this is a problem that exists today, and possibly it might get worse in the context of self-driving car. Yeah, I think it's a real issue, and it's really hard. I mean, Apple, one of the maybe the largest corporation or one of the largest corporations on earth, cannot prevent its iPhone software from being jailbroken. They keep trying. They've been trying for 8 years, and then the best hackers in the world get in and find an exploit and allow it to be jailbroken. So if Apple can't do this, and they're one of the best software and hardware companies in the world, we can imagine that it's hard for almost anyone. So I think it's going to be a real issue. I think it's hard to make things totally hack-proof. If people have enough incentive, they'll find exploits.
Okay, we have time for one final question, if there is one. Oh, all right, then please join me again in thanking Harry for his great talk. So